The executioner's axe had never missed its mark in 15 years. But as Magnus stared down at the slender neck of Lady Alara Blackwood, her golden hair spilling across the blood-stained execution block, he knew that perfect record was about to end, one way or another. The crowd in Castle Ravenshallow's town square roared for blood, their voices echoing off ancient stone walls. Lord Aldwyn sat forward in his ornate chair, thin lips curved in anticipation. But Magnus felt the heavy ceremonial axe waver in his calloused grip as Lady Alara lifted her eyes to meet his through his black leather hood. What he saw there wasn't guilt or fear. It was the pure defiance of someone whose only crime had been showing mercy in a merciless world. How had the kingdom's most feared executioner come to question a royal order for the first time in his life? Magnus had earned his reputation through precision, not brutality. While other executioners required multiple strikes or botched their work entirely, Magnus studied each condemned prisoner carefully, their height, the thickness of their neck, the exact angle needed for mercy. One clean cut, swift and certain, death without unnecessary suffering. It was the only kindness he could offer in his grim profession, and it had made him invaluable to 3 successive lords of Castle Ravenshollow. Even now, his analytical mind automatically assessed Lady Alara as she was dragged past, but not for execution, something else entirely. The commotion that shattered his morning solitude echoed even into his stone chambers beneath the castle. Shouts, clanging armor, and the unmistakable sounds of struggle drew him upward to investigate. In the great hall, Lord Aldwyn Greymont's guards dragged a young noblewoman across the rushes, her hands bound with rough rope, her blue velvet gown torn from resistance. Magnus studied her with the analytical eye that had served him well, assessing not for execution, but from pure curiosity about what could cause such an uproar. Lady Alara Blackwood was perhaps 25, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of winter's sapphires. Even disheveled and captive, she carried herself with fierce dignity that commanded attention despite her circumstances. "Treason against the crown," Lord Aldwyn declared to the assembled courtiers, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Lady Alara has been distributing grain meant for castle stores to the starving peasants, directly defying royal taxation orders. She has undermined crown authority and faces execution at dawn in 3 days." Magnus watched the accused woman carefully as the charges were read. Most condemned prisoners either wept, raged, or begged. Lady Alara simply stood straighter, her chin raised in proud defiance. "You would execute me for feeding hungry children?" she demanded, her clear voice carrying across the hall. "Then let history judge which of us is the true traitor to humanity." Lord Aldwyn's backhand cracked across her cheek, leaving an angry red mark. "Silence, you treasonous witch! 3 days in the dungeons should teach you humility before the axe ends your misguided rebellion." As the guards hauled her toward the dungeon stairs, Lady Alara's gaze swept the hall and locked momentarily with Magnus's eyes. In that brief connection, her defiant mask slipped just enough to reveal something that struck him like a physical blow. She wasn't a hardened criminal, but a young woman who had simply tried to do what was right. Magnus felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It would be hours before he recognized it as doubt. That evening found Magnus in the castle's lower kitchens, seeking out Willem the cook, one of the few people who treated him as human, rather than harbinger of death. The graying man was kneading bread dough when Magnus appeared in the doorway, like a dark specter. "The Blackwood woman," Magnus said without preamble. "What do you know of her so-called crimes?" Willem's hand stilled in the dough. He glanced nervously toward the kitchen entrance before lowering his voice. "Crimes? Feeding starving children is criminal now?" His weathered face twisted with disgust. "Lord Aldwyn's been bleeding the villages dry with his taxes. Families are dying of hunger while he hoards grain in the castle stores. Lady Alara used her own inheritance, every last coin, to buy grain and distribute it to those in need. Saving lives constitutes treason? According to our Lord, yes. Claims she undermined his authority. Willem's hands worked the dough more aggressively, taking out his anger on the innocent bread. Truth is, he can't stomach that a slip of a girl made him look like the heartless tyrant he is. The people love her for it, and he can't abide being shown up by someone with actual nobility in her soul. Magnus absorbed this information in troubled silence. In 15 years of executions, he had never questioned whether the condemned deserved their fate. Kings commanded, lords decreed, and he carried out their will with clinical precision. Justice was not his concern, only its implementation. But something about this case felt wrong. Unable to sleep, Magnus made another unprecedented decision. He descended past his own chambers into the dungeon levels, past empty cells to where condemned prisoners awaited their final dawn. Lady Alara sat on moldy straw in the farthest cell, her back straight despite her circumstances, carefully mending a tear in her dress with threads pulled from the hem. Her golden hair caught the torch's flickering light, seeming to push back against the dungeon's oppressive darkness. "Have you come to measure my neck for your axe, executioner?" she asked without looking up, her voice steady despite everything. Magnus was struck by her composure. "I have come to understand why you are here." This made her look up, studying his hooded face with those piercing blue eyes. "And what have you concluded?" "That you fed hungry children with your own money and called it charity, not treason." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Charity. Yes, I suppose that's what they'll carve on my tombstone. Here lies Alara Blackwood, executed for the unforgivable crime of compassion." Magnus stepped closer to the cell bars. Even in this wretched place, she maintained her dignity with an inner strength that commanded respect. "Do you regret what you did? Regret saving children from starvation?" Her eyes blazed with conviction. "Never. I would do it again tomorrow if I could. Some things matter more than royal decree, executioner. Some principles are worth dying for." Her words struck him with unexpected force. He had spent 15 years believing that duty was the highest virtue, that obedience to authority formed the foundation of civilized order. Yet here was a woman facing death for the crime of compassion, and she spoke of it with more honor than any knight he had known. "What is your name?" she asked softly. No condemned prisoner had ever asked him that. He was the executioner, faceless, nameless, merely an instrument of royal will. But something in her voice compelled honesty. "Magnus?" "Magnus." She repeated his name thoughtfully. "A strong name for a man who carries such a burden. Tell me, do you have family?" "No. My profession does not encourage attachments." How lonely that must be. Genuine sympathy colored her voice. Not pity, but understanding. "I have no family either now. My parents died in the plague 5 years ago, leaving me their lands, their titles, and their responsibility to those who depend on noble protection. I thought that's what true nobility meant." Magnus found himself sitting on the cold stone floor across from her cell, something he had never done with any prisoner. "And now? Now I understand that real nobility has nothing to do with birth or titles. It's about the choices we make when no one important is watching, about using whatever power we have to protect those who cannot protect themselves." She paused in her mending to meet his eyes. "What about you, Magnus? What do you believe nobility means?" The question hit him like a sword thrust. When had anyone asked what he believed? When had his thoughts mattered to anyone beyond his technical skill with an axe? "I have never considered it," he admitted. "Perhaps you should," she said gently. "We all have choices to make, executioner. Even you." Against all reason and 15 years of precedent, Magnus found himself returning to Lady Alara's cell each night. He brought fresh water from his own rations, decent food from the kitchens, and clean straw for her bedding. More importantly, he brought conversation. something they both had been starved of without fully realizing it. She told him about her childhood, about learning to read Latin and Greek when most noble daughters studied only needlework. She spoke of her parents' teachings about noblesse oblige, of the pure joy she'd felt seeing hungry children smile when she distributed bread and grain to their families. In return, Magnus found himself sharing fragments of his past he had never spoken aloud. How he'd been orphaned at 12 and apprenticed to the previous executioner. How he'd convinced himself that serving justice, even in its harshest form, was honorable work that required someone with steady nerves and precise skills. How the isolation of his position had slowly carved away pieces of his humanity until he wasn't certain what remained. But as they talked through the iron bars separating condemned from executioner, Magnus began to remember who he had been before 15 years of duty hardened him into a living instrument of death. "You're not what I expected," Ilara said on their second night, sitting close enough to the bars that he could see flecks of silver in her blue eyes. "Most people expect a monster. I expected someone who had forgotten how to feel." She reached through the bars, her fingertips finding his scarred knuckles. "Instead, I find a man who carries the weight of every life he's been ordered to take. You don't have to bear that burden alone anymore, Magnus." Her touch sent lightning through his entire body. When had anyone touched him with tenderness? When had anyone looked at him without fear or disgust? The sensation overwhelmed him, terrified him, and felt absolutely necessary all at once. "I have to execute you tomorrow," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know." Her fingers intertwined with his through the cold iron. "And I forgive you for it." "How?" The word came out raw with anguish. "How can you forgive me when I'm about to take your life?" "Because you're not choosing to take my life, Magnus. You're simply following the orders you've been trained to obey. But here, in this moment, you're choosing to see me as a person rather than just another condemned criminal. You're choosing human connection over isolation, kindness over indifference. That choice matters more than you know." Magnus stared at their joined hands, his scarred from years of dealing death, hers soft but strong from a life spent helping others. "I don't know if I can do it." "You know exactly what you can and cannot do," she said with gentle firmness. "The question is what you choose to do." The moment of choice. Dawn came with cruel swiftness. Magnus dressed in his ceremonial black robes and pulled on the leather hood that had hidden his face from countless crowds. The great executioner's axe felt heavier than ever as he lifted it from its stand. Not just the weight of steel and wood, but the accumulated burden of every life it had taken. The execution square filled with spectators hungry for blood sport. Lord Aldwyn occupied his platform seat, practically vibrating with anticipation. But Magnus also noticed something else. Hostile glances from castle guards, whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. A cold shoulder from the kitchen staff who usually nodded respectfully. Word had spread somehow about his visits to the prisoner. His unprecedented behavior had marked him as unreliable, potentially traitorous himself. When they brought Lady Ilara from the dungeons, Magnus's heart nearly shattered. They had dressed her in the traditional white shift of the condemned, and her unbound golden hair flowed down her back like liquid sunlight. She walked steadily to the block, accepting neither the crowd's jeers nor the chaplain's hollow comfort. As she knelt at the execution block, her eyes found his through the hood's shadow. No fear lived there, only profound sadness for what they both were about to lose. "Any final words?" Lord Aldwyn called out, his voice thick with satisfaction. Ilara's clear voice carried across the suddenly quiet square. "I die not as a traitor to the crown, but as a faithful servant to humanity. History will judge which of us chose true honor." Several people in the crowd murmured agreement despite themselves. Magnus raised the axe, feeling its terrible weight and the weight of 15 years of unquestioning obedience. But as he looked down at the woman who had shown him what it meant to choose compassion over duty, what it meant to see past law to justice itself, he knew with absolute certainty that he could not complete this execution. Not of her. Not of someone whose only crime was loving others more than she valued her own life. The ceremonial axe wavered in his grip as seconds stretched into eternity. Then Magnus made his choice, the first truly free choice of his adult life. The great axe fell, but not toward Lady Alara's neck. Instead, it clattered harmlessly onto the cobblestones as Magnus threw back his hood. "I cannot," he declared, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade. "This woman's only crime is showing mercy to the suffering. I will not be the instrument of this travesty." Chaos erupted instantly. Lord Aldwyn screamed orders while his guards hesitated, confused by this unprecedented defiance. Parts of the crowd cheered Magnus's rebellion, while others shouted for his blood instead. In the confusion, Magnus grabbed Alara's bound hands and pulled her to her feet. "Can you run?" he asked urgently. Magnus's 15 years in the castle served them well as they fled through servants' passages and forgotten stairways. His knowledge of every hidden route, every weak point in the fortress walls, had been gained through careful observation. The same analytical skills that had made him such an efficient executioner now served to save rather than take life. They escaped into the forest as Lord Aldwyn's men flooded the castle searching for them. But their freedom came at a terrible cost. They were now outlaws with prices on their heads, hunted by every authority in the kingdom. The abandoned monastery of St. Cuthbert, deep in the ancient woods, became their refuge. Its crumbling stone walls and broken roof offered shelter, while Lord Aldwyn's search parties scoured the countryside with increasing desperation. "Do you regret it?" Alara asked as they shared bread and cheese beside a small fire in the monastery's ruined chapel, the first real meal either had eaten in days. "Regret choosing you over duty?" Magnus reached out to touch her face, still marveling that she didn't flinch from his executioner's hands. "Never. But I fear what this means for your future. You were born to live as a lady, not as a hunted outlaw." "I was born to make choices that matter," she replied, leaning into his touch. "Choosing love over fear, choosing to stand against cruelty, these are the only choices that have ever truly mattered to me." In the flickering firelight of that holy ruin, surrounded by carved saints weathered by centuries, the executioner and the condemned woman found something neither had dared hope for: a love that transcended duty, social station, and the fear of death itself. But even as they held each other close, they both understood their sanctuary was temporary. "We cannot run forever," Magnus said on their fourth night in hiding. "Then we don't run," Alara replied with the same determined fire he'd seen in the dungeon. "We make our stand, but not alone. There are others who oppose Lord Aldwyn's cruelty. Villagers remember my charity. Some guards question his increasingly brutal orders. Even certain nobles disapprove of his methods, especially executing a woman for feeding hungry children." Using Magnus's intimate knowledge of the castle's every weakness and Alara's deep connections among the common people, they began weaving together something unprecedented. A coalition bound not by hatred of Lord Aldwyn, but by shared conviction that mercy should triumph over cruelty. Willem the cook became their eyes and ears within the castle walls. Sir Garrett, a young knight who had stood sickened during Alara's near execution, quietly spread word among the more honorable guards. Village elders who remembered Alara's charity coordinated safe houses and message routes. Slowly, carefully, they built a network of conscience. The most powerful weapon in their arsenal proved to be the story itself, the tale of an executioner who threw down his axe rather than shed innocent blood. It spread through the kingdom like wildfire, inspiring others who had long stayed silent in the face of injustice to finally find their voices. When Lord Aldwyn finally tracked them to the monastery ruins, he expected to find two desperate fugitives. Instead, he discovered the heart of a rebellion. Villagers who had been fed by Alara's charity stood beside castle guards who had grown sickened by their lord's increasingly vicious commands. Minor nobles, horrified by the near execution of a woman for showing mercy, had joined the growing coalition. Even some of Lord Aldwyn's own household knights had turned against him. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Faced with overwhelming opposition from his own people, subjects who had finally found the courage to say enough to his tyranny. Lord Aldwyn's remaining supporters melted away like morning frost. Justice, delayed but not denied, finally claimed the true criminal. King Edmund himself arrived 3 days later to investigate reports of rebellion in his lands. What he found was not treason, but righteousness. A woman who had chosen mercy over law, and a man who had chosen conscience over blind obedience, both in service to a higher justice that even kings must ultimately serve. In the monastery's rebuilt chapel, before the very altar where they had found love, Lady Alara was not only pardoned, but publicly honored for her courage and charity. Magnus, the executioner who had never missed a target, received clemency for his act of conscience, and more importantly, a new purpose. "You have shown us all what true justice looks like," King Edmund declared before the assembled crowd. Not the mechanical application of harsh law, but the wisdom to know when mercy serves justice better than punishment. As Magnus and Alara stood hand in hand, exchanging vows witnessed by those whose lives they had touched, Magnus marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. He was no longer the hooded figure of death, but simply a man who had learned that the greatest act of justice could be knowing when not to deliver it. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had followed orders that day?" Alara asked as they watched the sunset paint the chapel's restored windows with golden light. Magnus pulled her closer, his heart full of a peace he'd never expected to find. "I think we would have found each other somehow. Love this strong doesn't surrender to fear." In the end, the executioner who defied orders to save an innocent woman discovered that he had saved himself as well. In a world where duty often demanded cruelty, they had chosen to prove that love, compassion, and individual conscience would always be the higher law, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in following orders, but in knowing when to break them. And in the restored monastery where their love had first bloomed, they built a life dedicated to the radical notion that every person, noble or peasant, powerful or powerless, deserved both justice and mercy in equal measure. Please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next Chronicles. If you'd like to continue the journey, I chose another video for you to watch. See you next time.